The scorching summer sun beat down on Maple Grove Court, turning the quiet suburban street into a shimmering canvas of heat and tension. Mark Sullivan stood on his meticulously maintained back patio, his fingers gripping a cold glass of iced tea, watching the pristine blue water of his swimming pool ripple ever so slightly in the afternoon breeze. He had spent years perfecting this backyard oasis, from the carefully selected slate tiles to the custom-built pool fence that cost more than most people's annual vacation. Karen Thompson had been circling like a hawk for weeks, and today would be the breaking point. Mark knew the type all too well. As self-appointed neighborhood queen bee, Karen believed the world revolved around her and her two unruly children. Her McMansion sat directly across the street, its perfectly manicured lawn a testament to her obsessive need for control. But Mark's property was different. Here, order and tranquility reigned supreme. The first incident happened 3 weeks ago. Mark was watering his meticulously pruned rose bushes when Karen's kids, 8-year-old Tyler and 6-year-old Emma, came barreling across his carefully maintained lawn. Their wet swimsuits left dark, muddy prints on his immaculate grass, and their high-pitched screams shattered the peaceful afternoon. "Kids," Karen had called out from her driveway, not even bothering to move. "Be careful around Mr. Sullivan's yard." Careful wasn't in their vocabulary. Tyler had picked up a garden gnome, a vintage piece Mark had collected during a trip to Italy, and was using it as some sort of makeshift water gun. Emma was trampling his carefully cultivated flower beds, her tiny feet crushing delicate petals beneath her. Mark had maintained his composure. A retired project manager who had spent decades coordinating complex engineering projects, he understood the value of patience and strategic thinking. But something was brewing, and he knew it. Last Wednesday, the real confrontation began. Karen had marched across the street, her designer sunglasses perched atop perfectly highlighted hair, a look of entitlement etched into every line of her face. "Mark," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "the kids have been asking to use your pool. It's so much nicer than our community pool, and they're getting bored." The request wasn't a request at all. It was a demand disguised as a casual conversation. Mark had been direct. "I'm sorry, Karen, but my pool is private. It's not a community resource." Her smile had frozen. The pleasant facade cracked, revealing a hint of the aggressive suburban warrior beneath. "But the kids would be so careful," she insisted, taking a step closer. "It's not like I'm asking for anything unreasonable." Unreasonable was exactly what it was. Mark's pool wasn't just a swimming hole, it was his sanctuary. Every tile, every carefully selected piece of poolside furniture represented years of planning and personal investment. As he stood there that afternoon watching Karen's house and remembering their previous encounters, Mark knew his storm was coming. And he was prepared to weather it with the same precision he had applied to every other challenge in his life. Little did Karen know this was going to be a battle she would not win. The Neighborhood Homeowners Association meeting became Mark's first real test. Held in the community center's bland conference room, the gathering typically bored him to tears. But tonight was different. Karen had positioned herself strategically near the front, her perfectly pressed blazer and matching heels screaming of calculated preparation. Mark sat in the back, observing. He'd been a member of this community for 15 years, longer than most of the newer residents. His reputation was built on quiet reliability and respectful boundaries. Karen, who had moved in just 3 years ago, seemed determined to reshape the neighborhood's dynamics. "I'd like to discuss a community issue," Karen announced during the open forum, her voice hitting that pitch that suggested she was about to make a scene. Some homeowners aren't being neighborly. Some are putting their personal preferences above community spirit. Everyone knew she was talking about him. Frank Rodriguez, the association's longtime president, shifted uncomfortably. He knew Karen. She had already complained about everything from fence heights to lawn maintenance schedules. Her previous targets had typically capitulated just to stop her relentless pressure. Specifically, Karen continued, her eyes locked directly on Mark. "Some residents have beautiful amenities that could be shared. Take Mark Sullivan's pool, for example. It's sitting there unused most days while neighborhood children have limited swimming options." Mark felt the room's attention shift. He remained calm, his decades of professional training preventing any visible reaction. But internally, he was calculating his response with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Frank attempted to mediate. "Karen, private property is private property. The association guidelines are clear about personal amenities." But Karen wasn't finished. "Is it really neighborly to have such a beautiful pool and not allow children to enjoy it? What about community building? What about being a good neighbor?" Her rhetorical questions hung in the air, designed to make Mark look selfish. She knew exactly what she was doing, creating social pressure, attempting to shame him into compliance. What Karen didn't know was that Mark had dealt with far more challenging negotiations in his professional career. Corporate boardrooms were infinitely more treacherous than suburban homeowners association meetings. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Mark. Some seemed sympathetic to Karen's perspective, while others gave him knowing looks that suggested they understood the type of person she was. Margaret Henderson, an older resident who had lived on the street for over 2 decades, pulled Mark aside. "Don't let her bulldoze you," she whispered. "Some people think being loud means being right." Mark simply nodded, his strategy already forming. Karen had just elevated this from a personal dispute to a public performance, and he was more than prepared to match her move for move. That night, as he sat in his home office reviewing the evening's events, Mark began documenting everything. Karen's demands, the association meeting, potential witnesses. He recognized the emerging battlefield and was determined to maintain his ground with surgical precision. The pool war had officially begun. The escalation came swiftly and unexpectedly. One Saturday morning, Mark discovered Tyler and Emma Thompson in his backyard, pressed against the pool fence, their faces wet with tears and excitement. No adult supervision, no warning, just two children treating his private space like a public playground. Mark's security cameras had captured their entire approach. They had squeezed through a small gap in the hedge separating their properties, their swimsuits already on, beach towels clutched tightly. Their mother was nowhere in sight. When Mark stepped onto his patio, the children froze. Tyler, the older and bolder of the two, attempted a preemptive defense. "Mommy said we could swim," he blurted out, his voice wavering between defiance and fear. "This is private property," Mark responded coolly, his voice steady but firm. "You can't be here without permission." Emma started to cry, great heaving sobs that Mark was certain were calculated to provoke sympathy. But Mark had spent years managing emotional manipulation in corporate settings. These tactics were child's play, quite literally. He walked them back to the fence, making sure they got home safely. No physical contact, no raised voices, just pure, methodical control of the situation. Each step was deliberate, each word measured. Moments later, Karen's dramatic response came. She stormed across the street, her designer sandals clicking an aggressive rhythm on the pavement. Mark was already preparing his security footage, knowing precisely how this confrontation would unfold. "How dare you traumatize my children?" Karen screamed, her face turning an alarming shade of crimson. "They just wanted to swim. What kind of monster turns away children?" Mark remained calm. "Your children trespassed on my private property. They entered without permission, without adult supervision. This isn't about swimming. This is about respect for boundaries." Karen's next move was predictable. She threatened legal action, community ostracism, and every passive-aggressive tactic in her arsenal. "Everyone will know how heartless you are," she declared, her voice carrying down the entire street. But Mark had anticipated this. He had already spoken quietly with several longtime neighbors who understood property rights. Margaret Henderson and Frank Rodriguez from the Homeowners Association were firmly on his side, recognizing Karen's pattern of aggressive behavior. That evening, Mark installed additional security measures, a new higher fence with anti-climb features, motion-activated cameras, electronic gates with coveted access. His backyard would become an impenetrable fortress. The pool, his sanctuary, would remain his and his alone. What Karen didn't realize was that each of her aggressive moves was pushing Mark from passive resistance to active protection. She was creating the very outcome she claimed to hate, total exclusion. Mark understood something fundamental that Karen did not. Boundaries are not negotiable. They are not suggestions. They are fundamental lines of personal sovereignty. The war over the pool was just beginning, and Mark was prepared to fight with the calm, calculated precision of a strategist who knew exactly what was at stake. The next phase of Karen's campaign caught Mark completely by surprise. She began a systematic attempt to turn the entire neighborhood against him, weaponizing social media and local community groups with calculated precision. Her Facebook post went viral within their local community group. "Lonely retiree refuses to let neighborhood children enjoy simple summer pleasures," the inflammatory headline read. Accompanying the post were carefully cropped photos of Mark's pool, making it look like an Olympic-sized oasis that was criminally underutilized. And online comments poured in. Some neighbors who didn't know Mark personally began painting him as a villain, that bitter, childless man who had forgotten the joy of childhood. What they didn't know was the depth of Mark's story, the personal reasons behind his love for his private space. Mark's pool wasn't just a luxury, it was a memorial. 20 years ago, Mark and his late wife Elena had designed this pool together. Every tile, every carefully chosen piece of landscaping was a tribute to her memory. Elena had been a pediatric oncology nurse who loved swimming. After losing her to cancer, Mark had maintained the pool as a sanctuary of memories, a place of quiet reflection and personal healing. But he wasn't about to share that private pain with Karen or anyone else. Instead, he took a calculated approach. He contacted the neighborhood association's legal advisor, documenting Karen's harassment. He collected screenshots of her social media posts, recorded her verbal confrontations, and began building a comprehensive file. The turning point came during a neighborhood block party. Karen had clearly been working the crowd, whispering her narrative to anyone who would listen. But Margaret Henderson, a respected longtime resident, knew Mark's true character. "I've known Mark for 15 years," Margaret announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's the most reliable neighbor you could ask for. Always helps when someone needs a hand, always respectful. The kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back, just not forcibly." Her words created a ripple of doubt among the neighbors who had been quick to judge. Mark observed the interactions with the detached precision of a chess master. He didn't need to defend himself. The truth would eventually surface. What Karen didn't realize was that her aggressive tactics were slowly alienating her from the very community she sought to manipulate. Neighbors began to see through her performance, recognizing the difference between genuine community spirit and pure, unadulterated entitlement. Local parents who initially supported her began to pull back. They saw the increasingly erratic nature of her campaign against Mark. Her children's repeated attempts to breach his property had not gone unnoticed. Security footage didn't lie, and Mark had plenty of evidence. Late one evening, as Mark reviewed the day's events in his home office, he realized this was about more than just a pool. This was about boundaries, respect, and the fundamental right to personal space. Karen had turned a simple request into a neighborhood-wide spectacle, and she was about to learn that actions have consequences. The final act of this suburban drama was yet to be played, but Mark was prepared. His pool, his sanctuary, would remain exactly that. Untouched, inviolable, a testament to memories too precious to be shared with those who couldn't possibly understand. The legal notice arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail. Karen Thompson was suing Mark Sullivan for community obstruction and intentional emotional distress, seeking damages and a court-mandated community use agreement for his swimming pool. Mark's attorney, Robert Grayson, was an old friend who had handled his estate planning years ago. When Mark walked into his office with the lawsuit, Robert couldn't help but chuckle. "She's really gone off the deep end," he said, spreading the legal documents across his mahogany desk. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of suburban legal warfare. Karen had enlisted a young, aggressive attorney who specialized in what Robert called nuisance litigation. The document was filled with inflammatory language, painting Mark as a heartless curmudgeon who was destroying neighborhood morale by refusing to share his pool. What Karen didn't know was that Mark had been meticulously preparing for this moment. His security footage, witness statements, and documented history of Karen's harassment created a compelling counter-narrative. Robert began preparing a countersuit for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The legal proceedings became the talk of Maple Grove Court. Neighbors who had previously been on the fence now watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Karen's reputation was rapidly deteriorating. Her attempt to publicly shame Mark had backfired spectacularly. During a preliminary mediation session, Karen's true colors emerged fully. She argued that Mark's pool was a community resource that should be accessible to all neighborhood children. Her attorney tried to argue that Mark's refusal was causing psychological harm to the neighborhood's children. Robert Grayson dismantled their argument with surgical precision. He presented evidence of Mark's privacy, the personal significance of the pool, and Karen's repeated attempts to breach his property. He outlined a history of harassment that went far beyond a simple pool dispute. The mediation room fell silent. Karen's attorney began to realize they had severely miscalculated. What had seemed like an easy target, a retired widower, was proving to be a formidable opponent with extensive documentation and a rock-solid legal position. But the battle was taking its toll on Mark. Each legal document, each confrontation was a painful reminder of Elena. The pool had been their dream, their shared sanctuary. Now it was becoming a battleground. Margaret Henderson noticed the strain. She began rallying quiet support for Mark among the longtime residents. "This isn't about a pool," she would tell her friends. "This is about respect, about boundaries." As the legal proceedings dragged on, Mark found strength in unexpected places. Letters of support began arriving, some from neighbors, some from people who had heard about his story through local community networks. Each letter was a reminder that integrity often speaks louder than aggression. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her attempts to control the narrative were failing. Her children, feeling the stress of the ongoing conflict, began acting out. Tyler was suspended from school for disruptive behavior. Emma was struggling to make friends. The irony was not lost on Mark. In her quest to force community connection, Karen was destroying the very community spirit she claimed to champion. As the sun set on another day of legal maneuvering, Mark stood by his pool. The water remained calm, a mirror reflecting years of memories of love, of loss. Karen might wage her war, but this space, this sanctuary, would remain untouched. The final battle was approaching, and Mark was ready.